High in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers die and civilization becomes a distant memory, Jake Morrison built his fortress of solitude. For 15 years, he's lived off-grid in a cabin that most people couldn't find with GPS and a prayer. But someone, or something, has been watching him from the tree line. Jake learned the hard way that love is a weapon people use to destroy you. His ex-fiancée proved that when she cleaned out their joint accounts and disappeared with his business partner, leaving him broken and bankrupt. So he ran to these mountains, became a ghost, swore off human connection forever. But the pale figure with glowing eyes who appears at the edge of his property each night isn't exactly human. When she finally approaches his cabin under the blood moon, her words stop his heart cold. "I've waited in shadows for you." She knows things about his past that no living person should know. She speaks of decades of watching, of an impossible love that defies time itself. But what could an immortal creature possibly want with a man who's already dead inside? She stood there again, third night running. At first, Jake had convinced himself it was a deer caught in the strange interplay of moonlight and shadow. Mountain living taught you to see threats everywhere, bears, cougars, the occasional desperate soul lost in the wilderness. But deer didn't stand perfectly still for hours. Deer didn't watch you with the patience of carved stone. And deer definitely didn't have eyes that reflected light like polished silver coins. Jake's calloused fingers found the cold metal of his rifle, propped against the wall where it had lived for 15 years. He'd bought it for protection against four-legged predators, never imagining he might need it for whatever the hell was studying him from the tree line. The figure moved, gliding rather than walking, and Jake's breath caught. In all his years of isolation, he'd grown accustomed to the sounds of the mountain, the crack of settling wood, the distant call of owls, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But this thing moved without sound, like smoke given form. As it drew closer, details emerged that made Jake's rational mind rebel. The figure was a woman, that much was clear, but everything about her was wrong. Her skin held a luminescence that had nothing to do with the moonlight, pale as fresh snowfall, but with an underlying radiance that seemed to emanate from within. Her hair, dark as the void between stars, moved despite the absence of wind. And those eyes, Christ, those eyes burned with an inner fire that belonged in nightmares, not standing in his front yard. She stopped at the edge of his porch, just beyond the reach of his light. For a moment that stretched, like eternity, they regarded each other through the glass. The broken man who'd fled from the world, and the impossible creature who'd found him in his hiding place. Then she spoke, and her voice carried through the walls as if they were made of gossamer instead of solid pine. "I've waited in shadows for you." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. His grip on the rifle tightened, but his hands trembled with something that wasn't entirely fear. There was recognition in those words, a familiarity that shouldn't exist. 37 years ago, she continued, her voice a whisper that somehow filled the entire cabin. "You were 8 years old. You fell through the ice at Miller's Pond. Your father pulled you out, but not before you'd seen the bottom, not before you'd looked into the space between life and death." Jake's blood turned to ice water. Miller's Pond was 3 states away, part of a childhood he'd buried along with everything else when Sarah had destroyed his life. No one here knew about that day, about the moment when hypothermia had claimed him for precious seconds before his father's desperate CPR had dragged him back. "You've been running ever since," the woman said, stepping into the light. Up close, she was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Beautiful in the way that avalanches were beautiful, magnificent and utterly deadly. Running from that glimpse you caught of what lies beyond. Running from the knowledge that you've been marked. "What the hell do you want?" Jake's voice came out as a croak, rusty from years of speaking only to himself. A smile curved her lips, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "To offer you what you've been unconsciously seeking, what you've been preparing for in this wilderness." She gestured to the cabin, to his self-imposed exile. Freedom from the pain that love brings, freedom from the fear of betrayal. She stepped closer to the window, her breath creating no fog on the glass. Freedom from mortality itself. The storm that had raged for 3 days finally broke just before dawn, leaving the mountain draped in an eerie silence that felt more oppressive than the howling winds had been. Ezra stood at his kitchen window, steam rising from his coffee mug as he watched the mist curl between the pine trees like ghostly fingers. Something felt different about this morning, though he couldn't pinpoint what. It wasn't until he stepped onto his porch to check the damage that he saw them. Footprints in the fresh snow, circling his cabin in a perfect, deliberate pattern. His blood chilled. The prints were bare feet, impossibly clear despite the blizzard that should have filled them in hours ago. Worse still, they showed no signs of the stumbling gait of someone lost or seeking shelter. These were measured, purposeful steps. "What the hell?" he muttered, scanning the surrounding forest. The trees stood silent and still, their snow-laden branches creating deep shadows that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. He'd lived on this mountain for 15 years and had never seen anything like this. Bears left different tracks, and even the most desperate hiker wouldn't wander around barefoot in a blizzard. Back inside, Ezra tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to him like the mountain cold. He went through his morning routine, checking his water lines, stoking the fire, reviewing his supply inventory, but his eyes kept drifting to the windows. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every creak of the old cabin made him tense. It wasn't until afternoon that he noticed the other changes. Small things that would have meant nothing individually but together painted a disturbing picture. His coffee mug, which he distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen counter, now sat by the window overlooking the forest. The book he'd been reading, a worn copy of Thoreau that never left the table beside his chair, was now placed carefully on the mantel. Most unsettling of all, the heavy wooden bar he used to secure his door each night lay propped against the wall, though he had no memory of moving it. Ezra's hand instinctively moved to the hunting knife at his belt. In 15 years of isolation, he'd grown comfortable with solitude, even possessive of it. The idea that someone had been inside his sanctuary, moving through his space while he slept, felt like a violation of the most fundamental kind. As darkness crept across the mountain, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since his first winter here. He checked every lock, every window latch, every possible entry point. He even dragged an old dresser in front of the back door, though the rational part of his mind questioned what good it would do against someone who could apparently walk through snow without leaving a trail away from his cabin. The wind picked up again as night fell, sending snow devils swirling across the clearing. Ezra sat in his chair, shotgun across his knees, watching the darkness beyond his windows. He'd survived mountain lions, bears, and the kind of brutal winters that could kill a man in his sleep. He'd chosen this life specifically because it was predictable, controllable. Wild animals followed patterns, weather followed seasons, even the isolation followed rules he understood. This was something else entirely. Around midnight, he heard it. A sound so soft he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Footsteps on his porch, slow and deliberate. But when he crept to the window, shotgun ready, there was nothing there. Just the empty porch and the endless expanse of snow beyond. He was beginning to think exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind when he saw the shadow move past the kitchen window. Not the chaotic movement of wind-blown branches, but something fluid and purposeful. Something that moved like a person but seemed to flow rather than walk. Ezra's finger tightened on the trigger as he made his way toward the kitchen, every board that creaked under his feet sounding like a gunshot in the silence. His heart hammered against his ribs, and for the first time in years he found himself genuinely afraid. The footsteps on the porch resumed, circling the cabin just as they had in the snow, slow, patient, relentless. Whatever was out there wasn't going away, and Ezra was beginning to suspect that 15 years of self-imposed isolation had just come to an end. The axe bit deep into the oak, sending wood chips flying across the clearing. Elias pulled the blade free and swung again, letting the rhythm of splitting logs drown out the questions that had plagued him since dawn. 3 days had passed since the encounter in his cabin, and the memory refused to fade like a normal dream should. The pale stranger's eyes haunted him, those impossibly dark depths that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. And the cold, he'd never felt anything like it, as if winter itself had taken human form and wandered into his home. Another swing, another split log tumbling to the ground. "You're avoiding the truth." The voice came from directly behind him. Elias spun around, axe raised, heart hammering against his ribs. The stranger stood at the edge of the tree line, somehow having approached without making a sound on the carpet of fallen leaves. In daylight, the figure appeared even more otherworldly. Skin like polished marble, features sharp enough to cut glass, and those same penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through him. The stranger wore clothes that belonged to no particular era. A long coat that might have been fashionable decades ago, boots that looked handcrafted by some forgotten artisan. "How did you—" Elias began, then stopped himself. The question was pointless. Nothing about this person followed normal rules. "You've been thinking about me." It wasn't a question. The stranger's voice carried an accent Elias couldn't place, something old and refined that spoke of distant lands and forgotten centuries. "I think about a lot of things when I'm alone." Elias kept the axe ready, though he suspected it would be useless if this encounter turned violent. "Doesn't mean they're real." A smile ghosted across the stranger's lips, the first expression Elias had seen there. It was beautiful and terrible at once, revealing teeth that were just a shade too sharp, too perfect. "My name is Damien," the stranger said, taking a step closer. "And I am very real." The name hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elias found himself lowering the axe slightly, drawn in despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "What do you want from me?" Damien tilted his head, studying Elias with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "I've been asking myself that question for longer than you might imagine." "How long have you been watching me?" The words tumbled out before Elias could stop them. Some part of him already knew the answer would be impossible to accept. "Since you first came to this mountain." 7 years, 4 months, 16 days. Damien's precision was unnerving. "You arrived in winter, half dead from grief and rage, determined to bury yourself in this wilderness." Ice formed in Elias's veins. No one knew the exact timeline of his retreat from civilization. He'd made sure of that, covering his tracks both literally and figuratively when he'd fled the ruins of his former life. "You don't know anything about me," Elias said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know about Margaret." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. The axe slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, thudding onto the ground between them. Margaret, his fiancée, his betrayer, the woman who'd smiled and planned their wedding while secretly selling his family's land to developers, bankrupting his inheritance and destroying 3 generations of hard work. "Don't." The word came out as barely a whisper. Damien moved closer, and Elias caught that strange scent again, earth and copper and something indefinably ancient. "I know how she convinced you to sign over power of attorney, how you discovered her deception the night before your wedding, how you found her in your bed with her real lover, celebrating their successful con." "Stop!" Elias stumbled backward, his shoulder blades hitting the rough bark of a pine tree. The memories crashed over him like a dam bursting. Margaret's laughter when she realized he'd caught her, the casual cruelty in her voice as she explained how easy it had been to manipulate him, the complete destruction of everything he'd thought was real. "You came here to die," Damien continued, relentless. "Not quickly, but slowly, letting the mountain take you piece by piece until nothing remained of the man who'd been foolish enough to believe in love. What are you?" The question tore from Elias's throat. Damien was close enough now that Elias could see the complete absence of warmth in his breath, the way shadows seemed to bend toward him like living things seeking shelter. "I am what happens when love becomes hunger," Damien said softly, "when devotion transforms into something darker and more enduring than human hearts can comprehend." The confession hung between them, heavy with implications Elias wasn't ready to process. But even as fear crawled up his spine, he found himself unable to look away from those impossible eyes. "Why tell me this? Why reveal yourself now?" Damien's hand rose slowly, fingers hovering just inches from Elias's face. The air between them crackled with tension and something else, a pull Elias couldn't name but felt in his bones. "Because, my dear Elias," Damien whispered, "I think I'm growing hungry again." The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them both in a dance of careful avoidance and electric tension. Marcus found himself hyper-aware of every sound, the soft whisper of bare feet on wooden floors, the almost inaudible rustle of movement in the cabin's shadowed corners. She never seemed to sleep, this woman who claimed no name, and he began to wonder if she ever truly rested at all. On the 3rd morning, when the wind finally died to a whisper and pale sunlight struggled through the dissipating clouds, Marcus discovered her standing before the window, staring out at the snow-laden pines with an expression of profound melancholy. She hadn't moved in over an hour, and in the weak morning light, her skin held an almost translucent quality that made his chest tighten with unease. "The storm's past," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Road should be clear enough by afternoon." She didn't turn, but he saw her shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I suppose it has." The finality in her tone stirred something uncomfortable in his gut. Not relief, as he'd expected, but something dangerously close to regret. He pushed the feeling down, focusing instead on the practical matter of her departure. He'd grown too comfortable with her presence, too accustomed to the way she moved through his space like she belonged there. "I'll walk you to the main road," he offered, though hospitality felt foreign on his tongue after so many years of solitude. "That's unnecessary." Her reflection in the window showed eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. "I know these mountains better than you might think." Something in her phrasing nagged at him. He studied her profile, noting again the aristocratic curve of her jaw, the way she held herself with unconscious grace. "You've been here before." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it as one. Instead, she finally turned from the window, and the full force of her attention hit him like a physical blow. Her eyes, he realized, weren't quite brown as he'd first thought, but amber shot through with gold, the color of aged whiskey held up to candlelight. "Many times," she admitted, moving toward the fireplace where the flames had burned low. She knelt gracefully, feeding fresh logs to the fire with practiced ease, as if she'd performed this exact action in this exact place countless times before. "When?" The word came out sharper than he'd intended, edged with an accusation he couldn't quite name. Her hands stilled on the poker, and for a moment the only sound was the crackle of catching wood. "Does it matter? Someone's been watching my cabin for months, maybe longer." He stepped closer, studying her face for tells, for the micro-expressions he'd learned to read during his years in the service. "You know something about that?" She rose smoothly, still gripping the iron poker, and something in her posture shifted. The careful vulnerability she'd worn like a mask seemed to slip away, revealing something altogether more dangerous underneath. "You're perceptive. Answer me." "Or what?" The poker gleamed in her grip, but she held it with the casual confidence of someone who didn't need weapons to be deadly. "You'll force me out into the snow, threaten me with your father's rifle?" The mention of his father's gun, locked away in the bedroom closet, sent ice through his veins. He'd never mentioned his father, never spoken of the rifle. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, muscle memory taking over. "How do you know about—" "I know many things, Marcus." His name on her lips carried weight, as if she'd spoken it countless times in his absence. "I know you take your coffee black, because cream reminds you of the way Isabel used to doctor hers. I know you split wood when you can't sleep, which is why your pile never seems to diminish, despite burning fires all winter. I know you talk to your father's ghost on the anniversary of his death, standing right there by the kitchen window." Each revelation hit like a physical blow, stripping away the illusion of privacy he'd built around his isolation. "You've been watching me." "Yes." The simple admission hung between them, heavy with implications he didn't want to examine. Anger warred with something else, a twisted fascination that he refused to acknowledge. "Who are you?" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and he was surprised to find his hand trembling slightly as it gripped the knife handle. She set the poker aside with deliberate care, and when she looked at him again, her eyes held flecks of something that might have been sadness or might have been hunger. "Someone who has been alone far longer than you, Marcus. Someone who understands the weight of betrayal, the comfort of solitude, and the danger of wanting things that can only destroy you." She moved toward the door with fluid grace, pausing only to gather the cloak he'd forgotten she'd arrived wearing. "The storm has passed. Perhaps it's time I left after all." But as her hand touched the door handle, Marcus found himself speaking words that surprised them both. "Don't." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that felt almost sacred. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, watching steam rise from the wet earth as morning sunlight filtered through the pine boughs. His coffee had gone cold in his hands, forgotten as he replayed the previous night's impossible encounter. A vampire. The word tasted foreign in his mind, like something borrowed from late-night movies and Gothic novels. Yet he couldn't dismiss what he'd witnessed: the inhuman speed, the predatory grace, the way moonlight had seemed to bend around that pale figure. Most unsettling of all were those ancient eyes that had looked at him with an intimacy he hadn't earned, as if she'd been studying him for far longer than a few stolen glimpses. Marcus set down his mug and pulled on his boots. The mundane ritual of checking his traps and surveying storm damage might restore some semblance of normalcy to a world that had shifted beneath his feet overnight. He stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply of the clean mountain air, and froze. Carved into the wet earth of his front yard was a message, the letters precise and deliberate: "Thank you for the shelter." Below the words, pressed into the mud like a signature, was the perfect impression of a bare foot, small, elegant, and utterly impossible in its clarity. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the tree line. She'd been here, while he'd tossed restlessly in his bed, wrestling with doubt and disbelief. She'd stood mere feet from his front door. The thought sent an unwelcome thrill through him that he tried desperately to suppress. The day passed in a blur of distraction. Marcus found himself pausing in his work to study shadows that moved wrong, listening for sounds that existed only in his imagination. When evening approached, he barricaded himself inside, checking locks he'd never bothered with before and drawing curtains against windows he'd always left bare. But solitude, once his greatest comfort, now felt oppressive. The cabin walls seemed to press inward, filled with the weight of secrets he couldn't comprehend. He paced the small space like a caged animal, torn between terror and a curiosity that grew stronger with each passing hour. The soft knock at his door came just after midnight. Marcus's blood turned to ice water. 3 gentle raps, deliberate and patient, echoing through the silence like a death knell. He pressed his back against the far wall, hardly daring to breathe. "I know you're awake, Marcus." Her voice drifted through the wooden barrier, melodic and strangely soothing. "I can hear your heart racing from here." "Go away," he managed, his voice hoarse with fear. "I could. I've been going away for 37 years. The admission hung in the air like smoke. But I find myself weary of the distance. 37 years. The number struck him like a physical blow. That's impossible. Is it? You've lived here since you were 25, Marcus. I watched you build the addition to the east wall. I saw you plant the garden that first spring, cursing the rocky soil. I was there the night you burned her letters in the fire pit, when you finally stopped waiting for Sarah to come back. The sound of his ex-wife's name from this creature's lips felt like a violation. You had no right. I had no right to watch, and even less right to care, yet here we are. A pause, filled with the soft sound of wind through pine needles. "I'm not here to hurt you. Then what do you want?" When she answered, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it, "To stop running from what I feel." Against every instinct screaming at him to stay put, Marcus found himself approaching the door. His hand hovered over the deadbolt, trembling. What you feel? Loneliness recognizes loneliness, Marcus. I've spent centuries perfecting the art of isolation, convincing myself it was strength. But watching you these years, seeing how you've built a life in the spaces between heartbeats, it's shown me the difference between solitude chosen and solitude endured. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood. You're a vampire. Yes. You could kill me without breaking a sweat. Yes. Another pause. But I could also show you wonders you've never imagined. I could give you time, real time, not the brief flicker mortals call a lifetime. I could make you understand what it means to exist beyond the reach of loss. The offer hung between them, seductive and terrifying. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the devastation Sarah's betrayal had wrought, the careful walls he'd built to protect what remained of his heart. Those walls had become his prison, but they were also his salvation. I need time to think, he whispered. Time is all I have. Her footsteps retreated across the porch, but her voice lingered like a caress. I'll be waiting when you're ready to stop hiding from the world. As silence reclaimed the night, Marcus remained pressed against the door, wondering if he'd just been offered redemption or damnation, and why, for the first time in decades, he found himself hoping for the courage to find out. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke just as darkness settled over the mountain. Rain hammered against the cabin's windows with supernatural fury, and Marcus found himself grateful for the thick log walls that had sheltered him through countless such nights. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't alone. Elena sat across from him at the small wooden table, her pale hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't touched it, of course. Marcus was beginning to understand that many of her human gestures were merely performances, muscle memory from a mortality she'd lost centuries ago. Tell me about her, Elena said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the storm's rage. Marcus's hand tightened around his own mug. Who? The woman who broke you. Elena's silver eyes met his, unflinching. The one who made you build these walls around your heart. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating Elena's face in stark relief. For a moment, she looked almost skeletal, all sharp angles and shadows. Then the light faded, and she was beautiful again, terrifyingly so. Sarah, Marcus said, surprised by how easily her name came. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. Her name was Sarah. Elena nodded, encouraging him to continue with nothing more than patient silence. We were together for 3 years, met in college, planned to marry after graduation. The words felt rusty, like tools left too long unused. I thought she loved me. Hell, I was certain of it. She said all the right things, made all the right promises. But she was sleeping with my best friend. Had been for months. Marcus laughed bitterly. Found out the day before I was going to propose, walked in on them in our apartment, in our bed. Elena's expression darkened, and for just an instant, Marcus caught a glimpse of something predatory flickering behind her eyes. What did you do? Nothing dramatic, no violence, no screaming matches. I just left, packed what I could carry, withdrew my savings and drove until I found this place. He gestured around the cabin. Been here ever since. 15 years, Elena murmured. You would know, wouldn't you, since you've been watching me? The accusation held no heat now, just weary acceptance. Elena had the grace to look ashamed. I never meant to intrude on your grief. At first, I was simply curious about the human who'd chosen such isolation. But as the years passed, she trailed off, her fingers drumming silently against the table's surface. You felt sorry for me. No, the word came sharp and immediate. I envied you. Your capacity to feel so deeply that heartbreak could drive you to remake your entire existence. Do you know what that looks like to someone like me? Someone who has loved and lost and watched everyone I've ever cared about crumble to dust. Elena stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Rain streaked the glass like tears, distorting her reflection into something ghostly. I am 437 years old, Marcus. I have loved mortal men and watched them age and die. I have loved immortals and watched them grow cold and cruel over the decades. I have loved and buried and mourned until I thought I had no capacity for feeling left. She pressed her palm against the glass. And then I saw you, choosing isolation over risking that pain again, and I understood that your heart wasn't broken. It was just sleeping. Something twisted in Marcus's chest, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. Hope, perhaps, or terror, maybe both. Why are you telling me this? Elena turned from the window, and in the firelight, her pale skin seemed to glow. Because I'm tired of watching from the shadows, because 53 years is long enough to observe someone before introducing yourself properly. 53? Marcus stood slowly. But I've only been here 15 years. A smile ghosted across Elena's lips, sad and knowing. Oh, my dear Marcus. Did you think this was our first meeting? I was there the day you were born. I was there when you took your first steps. I was there the night Sarah broke your heart. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I have been waiting for you your entire life. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sparks dancing up the chimney like tiny spirits seeking escape. Outside, the storm raged on, but Marcus barely heard it over the thundering of his own pulse. That's impossible, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, memories stirred. A pale woman glimpsed in crowds throughout his childhood, a figure at the edge of his vision during his darkest moments, always beautiful, always watching, always just out of reach. Elena stepped closer, and Marcus caught her scent, old roses and winter air, wild and intoxicating. Is it? She asked. Or is it just terrifying? Marcus looked into her ancient eyes and realized he couldn't tell the difference anymore. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke just as Elias stepped outside to check the perimeter. Rain lashed against his face with startling violence, and lightning split the sky in jagged white scars. He pulled his collar higher and pressed forward, his boots squelching in the rapidly forming mud. Something was wrong. The forest felt different tonight, charged with more than just electricity from the storm. Every shadow seemed to writhe with malevolent intent, and twice he could have sworn he saw pale figures darting between the trees, always just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. When he returned to the cabin 20 minutes later, soaked to the bone and increasingly uneasy, he found Vera standing at the window with her back to him. She hadn't moved from that position since he'd left, her silhouette perfectly still against the storm-lit glass. "See anything interesting out there?" he asked, shrugging out of his wet jacket. She turned, and the expression on her face made his blood freeze. Her usual composure had cracked, revealing something raw and dangerous underneath. Her eyes held a wildness he'd never seen before, pupils dilated until they appeared almost black. "They've found me," she said simply. Elias felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Who's found you?" "My kind, the ones I told you about." She moved away from the window with fluid grace, but he could sense the tension coiled in her muscles. "I'd hoped we had more time." As if summoned by her words, something struck the cabin's exterior wall with tremendous force. The entire structure shuddered, and several books tumbled from their shelves. A sound followed, not quite human, but close enough to raise every hair on Elias's arms. "How many?" he asked, moving instinctively toward his rifle. "3, maybe 4. Vera's voice had taken on an otherworldly quality, deeper and more resonant than before. "Ancient ones. They won't be deterred by mortal weapons." Another impact, this time against the front door. The heavy oak groaned under the assault, and Elias could hear the metal hinges beginning to protest. He grabbed his rifle anyway, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. What do they want? To bring me back, to punish me for my transgressions. She looked at him then, and he saw something that might have been regret flicker across her features. "I've broken laws older than your civilization by involving myself with you." The attacks on the cabin intensified. Windows rattled in their frames, and something with claws scraped against the roof overhead, moving back and forth like a caged predator. Through the storm, Elias could hear voices, if they could be called that, speaking in a language that hurt his ears and made his teeth ache. "There's something else," Vera continued, her gaze never leaving his face. "Something I haven't told you about what it means to be connected to one of us." "Now seems like a poor time for revelations," Elias muttered, positioning himself near the door with his rifle raised. "The bond we've formed, it's already begun to change you." Her words came faster now, urgent. "You're stronger than you were a week ago. Your senses are sharper. You've noticed it, haven't you?" He had noticed. The way he could track movement in his peripheral vision that should have been too quick to catch. The way sounds carried to him from impossible distances. The way his body had begun to crave things it never had before, mainly her presence, but other things too. Rarer meat, darkness, the taste of copper. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whether you choose immortality or not, you're already becoming something more than human." She moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the rain and something darker, more primal. "The process can be stopped, but only if—" The front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. 3 figures stood in the doorway, and Elias's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. They looked human at first glance, but everything about them was wrong. Too tall, too pale, moving with a liquid grace that defied anatomy. Their eyes reflected the cabin's light like an animal's, and when they smiled, their teeth were razors. "Vera," the center figure spoke, its voice like grinding stone. "You will come with us now. The council grows impatient, and the human dies," added another, its gaze fixed on Elias with predatory hunger. "Clean up your mess, sister." Vera stepped protectively in front of Elias, and the change that came over her was terrifying to behold. Her human facade dropped completely, revealing the apex predator beneath. Her movements became serpentine, her fingernails extended into claws, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "You'll have to go through me first." The lead creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Gladly." The cabin erupted into violence as ancient powers collided, and Elias found himself caught in the middle of a war he barely understood. The storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain against the cabin windows with violent intensity. Thomas stood at the kitchen sink, washing the remnants of their shared dinner from the dishes, hyper-aware of Ilara's presence behind him. She sat curled in the old leather chair by the fire, reading one of his books, a collection of Yeats' poetry that had belonged to his mother. The domestic scene felt surreal. 3 weeks had passed since she'd revealed her true nature, and somehow they'd fallen into this strange rhythm of coexistence. Days filled with cautious conversation and stolen glances, evenings spent in comfortable silence or heated debates about literature and philosophy. It was almost normal, if normal could include a centuries-old vampire who didn't need to eat the food she nevertheless prepared, with startling skill, or sleep in the bed she'd claimed in his spare room. "The storm's getting worse," Thomas said, drying his hands on a worn dish towel. Through the window he could see tree branches whipping in the wind. "It will pass by dawn," Ilara replied without looking up from her book. "They always do." Her certainty about such things no longer surprised him. She spoke of weather patterns like someone who'd observed them across lifetimes, which, he supposed, she had. The thought still made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name, not fear exactly, but something close to vertigo. The vastness of her existence made him feel insignificant and precious all at once. A massive crack of thunder shook the cabin, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. "Trees down," Thomas said into the sudden darkness. "Probably took out the power line." He heard her move with that unnatural grace, and suddenly she was beside him, close enough that he could feel the coolness radiating from her skin. In the darkness, her eyes held that faint luminescence he'd grown accustomed to, like starlight on water. "I can see it," she said softly. "A large pine fell across the path about 50 yards from here. The road will be impassable until someone clears it." Thomas felt a flutter of something that might have been panic or anticipation. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the outside world more completely than usual. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and with the storm raging, no one would be coming to check on him for days. "I'll get the generator running," he said, starting toward the door. Her hand caught his arm, fingers cold through his flannel shirt. "Thomas, wait. Let me. It's not safe out there. The wind won't affect me the way it would you." Her grip tightened slightly. "Please, let me do this." There was something vulnerable in her tone, almost pleading. He realized she wanted to take care of him, to be useful in some tangible way. The understanding hit him like a physical blow. This ancient, powerful creature was asking for the simple human dignity of being needed. "The generator's in the shed behind the cabin," he said quietly. "But Ilara, be careful." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in days, and it transformed her face completely. For a moment, she didn't look like a predator or an otherworldly being. She looked like a woman who'd been given a gift. She was gone and back before he could fully process her absence, the generator's steady hum filling the silence as the lights flickered back to life. When she reappeared in the doorway, she was soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her head and her clothes clinging to her form. Water dripped from her onto the wooden floor. "You're drenched," Thomas said, grabbing a clean towel from the linen closet. "I don't get cold," she reminded him, but she accepted the towel anyway. As she dried her hair, Thomas found himself staring. There was something about seeing her like this, disheveled, almost human, that made his chest ache. She'd gone out into a dangerous storm for him, had wanted to protect him, and the gesture felt more intimate than any touch they'd shared. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze. "Nothing. Thank you." The air between them shifted, charged with more than the electricity of the storm. Ilara stepped closer, and Thomas could see drops of rain still clinging to her eyelashes, could smell the petrichor scent of the storm on her skin. "Thomas," she said, his name barely a whisper. He reached up without thinking, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. Her skin was silk smooth and cold, but when she leaned into his touch, he felt something ignite in his chest, dangerous and terrifying and absolutely inevitable. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something else entirely was beginning. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and sharp in the morning light. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, watching steam rise from his coffee mug, while his mind wrestled with fragments of the previous night. Had he really seen those eyes, ancient, hungry, possibly knowing? The rational part of his brain insisted it was exhaustion, isolation playing tricks on him, but his body remembered the electric tension, the way the air itself had seemed to thicken with presence. A knock at his door shattered the morning quiet. Marcus froze, coffee mug halfway to his lips. In 15 years on this mountain, no one knocked on his door. No one even knew where to find him, which was precisely how he'd planned it. The sound came again, 3 measured raps that somehow managed to be both polite and commanding. He set down his mug and moved toward the door, every instinct screaming caution. Through the thick wood he could hear nothing, no shuffling feet, no breathing, no sign of life at all. His hand hesitated on the deadbolt. "I know you're there, Marcus." The voice was silk and shadow, feminine but carrying an undertone that raised the hair on his arms. "We need to talk." His name on those lips sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, he turned the lock and opened the door. She stood on his porch like she belonged there, as if she'd materialized from his darkest dreams, tall and ethereally pale, with raven-black hair that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath, the same impossible silver he'd glimpsed in the darkness, ancient and predatory and utterly captivating. "Hello, Marcus." She smiled, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "May I come in?" Something in the careful way she asked the question triggered a memory, old folklore, half-forgotten warnings about thresholds and invitations. "Who are you?" My name is Celeste. She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like prey. I've been watching you for a very long time. The admission should have terrified him. Instead, Marcus found himself stepping back, gesturing her inside. She moved with fluid grace, her feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Now that she was in his space, he could see her more clearly. The porcelain perfection of her skin, the way her dark clothes seemed to flow around her like liquid shadow. Watching me, he repeated, closing the door. How long? Since you first came to this mountain, since you ran from your broken heart and sworn off human connection. Her smile turned sad. 15 years, Marcus. I've watched you build this fortress of solitude, seen you turn away every lost hiker, every attempt at human contact. The words hit him like physical blows. That's impossible. I would have seen you. Would you? She moved to his fireplace, running one pale finger along the mantel. You see what you choose to see, but I've been there, in the shadows when you chop wood, in the tree line when you sit on your porch at sunset, always close enough to help if you needed it, never close enough to disturb your precious isolation. Marcus backed against the door, his pulse hammering. What are you? Instead of answering, she picked up the framed photograph from his mantel, the only picture he'd kept from his old life. Sarah, radiant and laughing, her engagement ring catching the light. The betrayal felt fresh again, seeing those features in Celeste's hands. She hurt you badly, Celeste said softly. Promised you forever, then left you for your best friend. The pain drove you here, to this mountain, to this self-imposed exile. Put that down. His voice came out rougher than intended. Celeste set the frame back gently. I'm not her, Marcus. I'm not some fickle human who will promise eternity and deliver disappointment. She turned to face him fully. I can give you actual eternity if you're brave enough to take it. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus found his voice. What are you? I think you already know. She moved closer, and he caught her scent. Winter air and old roses, and something darker underneath. Your folklore-loving grandmother told you the stories, didn't she? About creatures that walk in shadow, that live forever, that hunger for more than food. Vampire. The word hung unspoken between them, too impossible to voice yet too obvious to deny. Why? He whispered. Why watch me? Why reveal yourself now? Celeste stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough that he could see the silver flecks in her impossible eyes. Because 15 years is long enough to mourn the living, Marcus. Because loneliness is a poison that kills more surely than any blade. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And because I've fallen in love with the man you've become in your solitude, strong, self-sufficient, beautifully broken. The confession hung in the air like a challenge, like a promise, like a threat. The storm had passed, but Marcus felt as though another was brewing inside his chest. 3 days had elapsed since Lydia's revelation, 3 days of careful distance and stolen glances. She moved through his cabin like a ghost made flesh, real enough to touch but somehow still untouchable. The knowledge of what she was sat between them like a chasm he didn't know how to cross. He found her standing at the kitchen window as dawn broke, her silhouette perfectly still against the pale light. No breath misted the glass, no fidgeting or shifting weight, just absolute stillness that should have been unnerving but instead struck him as profoundly lonely. Do you miss it? He asked quietly, not wanting to startle her despite knowing such a thing was likely impossible. Miss what? Being human, eating, sleeping, all the mundane things. She turned toward him, and he caught something vulnerable in her expression before she composed herself. I miss the sun on my skin without pain. I miss the taste of bread fresh from the oven, her fingers traced patterns on the windowsill. I miss not having to watch everyone I care about grow old and die while I remain unchanged. The weight in her voice made his chest tighten. Is that why you stayed away so long? After that first night? Partly. She moved to the table where he'd left his morning coffee growing cold. I've learned not to get attached. It's a lesson carved deep after centuries of practice. But you came back. I always came back. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as him. even when I swore I wouldn't, even when I told myself it was cruelty to both of us. Marcus studied her face, searching for answers to questions he was still afraid to ask. What happened to you? Before, I mean. What made you this way? Something shifted in her expression, a door slamming shut. That's not a story for dawn, Marcus. Then when? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. There was a plague in my village. People were dying faster than we could bury them. A stranger came promising salvation, offering to save the healthy ones. Her laugh was bitter. I was 17 and terrified of dying. I begged him to save me. And he did. He saved me from death, yes, but not from dying. She met his eyes. I've been dying slowly ever since, watching piece by piece of my humanity slip away. The pain in her confession made him want to reach for her, but something held him back. Is that what you think? That you're not human anymore? I drink blood to survive, Marcus. I can tear a man apart with my bare hands. I've killed more people than you've probably met in your entire life. Her voice remained steady, but he caught the tremor underneath. What part of that sounds human to you? The part that's been watching over me for decades without harming me. The part that looks at sunrises like they're breaking your heart. The part that's standing here now, trusting me with your truth. She stared at him, something unguarded flickering across her features. You don't understand what I am, what I'm capable of. Then show me. The words escaped before he could think them through. The moment they hung in the air between them, he knew he meant them completely and was terrified of them in equal measure. Marcus. His name was a warning. Show me, he repeated, stepping closer. If you want me to understand what you are, then show me, all of it. Her control cracked just enough for him to see the predator beneath. Her eyes darkened to something inhuman, and when she smiled, he caught the gleam of fangs. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You want to see the monster? She moved, faster than his eyes could follow, suddenly close enough that he could feel the unnatural cold radiating from her skin. Her hand wrapped around his throat, not squeezing but holding him in place with impossible strength. I could kill you before your heart beats again. I could drain every drop of blood from your body and feel nothing but satisfaction. His pulse hammered against her palm, but he didn't try to pull away. But you won't. How can you be so certain? Because if you wanted me dead, I would have been dead years ago. His voice came out steady despite the supernatural grip on his throat. Because you're not showing me a monster, Lydia. You're showing me someone who's been hurt so badly she's forgotten how to trust her own heart. Her grip loosened, and for a moment her control wavered completely. He saw the creature she could be, all sharp edges and deadly grace. But underneath it, he saw the woman who watched sunrises and mourned her lost humanity. You're going to destroy me, she whispered. Maybe, he said softly. Or maybe we'll destroy each other. Or maybe we'll find something worth saving. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across Ilara's pale features as she began her tale. Marcus gripped his coffee mug tighter, the ceramic warm against his palms, anchoring him to the present moment, even as her words transported him across centuries. I was turned in 1847, she said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated years. In a small village outside Prague, I was 19, betrothed to a blacksmith's son, dreaming of nothing more than a cottage full of children and a garden where I could grow herbs. Her fingers traced patterns in the air, as if she could still feel the texture of those long-ago dreams. The vampire who made me was ancient even then. He called himself Casimir, and he collected beautiful things, paintings, sculptures, rare books, and young women he thought possessed some indefinable quality worth preserving forever. Marcus felt his jaw clench. He took your choice away. Completely. Her laugh held no humor. I fought him, of course, screamed until my throat was raw, begged him to let me die rather than become what he was. But Casimir believed he was giving me a gift. Eternal beauty, he said. Eternal youth. He couldn't understand why I wept for weeks afterward, mourning the life I'd never have. The wind howled outside the cabin, and Marcus found himself grateful for its solid walls, for the illusion of safety they provided. "What happened to your family? Your fiancé?" "I had to watch them age and die from the shadows," she whispered. "I couldn't return to them. What would I say? How could I explain that I no longer ate food, that sunlight burned my skin, that the scent of their blood made my teeth ache with hunger? So I became a ghost, haunting the edges of their lives, present but never able to participate." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where snow continued to fall in thick curtains. For decades, I was Casimir's reluctant companion. He paraded me through the courts of Europe, introduced me to other vampires who saw humans as nothing more than cattle. I learned to hunt, to feed, to survive in a world that no longer felt like mine. "But you escaped him." Eventually, her reflection was absent from the glass, Marcus noticed with a start. Another reminder of what she was, what separated them. Casimir grew careless in his confidence. During the chaos of the American Civil War, when death was everywhere and a few more bodies wouldn't be questioned, I finally found my chance. I killed him while he slept in a brothel in New Orleans. The casual way she spoke of murder should have terrified him. Instead, Marcus felt something that might have been pride. "Good." She turned to face him, surprise flickering across her features. "You're not horrified." "Some monsters deserve killing." He thought of Sarah, of her cruel laughter as she walked away with his brother. Not the same thing, perhaps, but betrayal left its own kind of scars. "What did you do after?" "I wandered, tried to find purpose in a world that had moved on without me. I fed when I had to, tried to choose victims who wouldn't be missed, criminals, men who hurt women, those society had already deemed disposable, but the guilt never left me. Every life I took, even in the name of justice, felt like another piece of my humanity slipping away." She returned to her chair, her movements carrying that impossible grace he was beginning to recognize as purely vampire. "Then I found this mountain, found you. How long have you been watching me?" 15 years. The admission hung between them like a confession. "I was hunting in the valley below when I first caught your scent. There was something about it, something that called to me in a way I couldn't understand. I followed you back to this cabin, watched you chop wood and tend your garden, and live this simple, honest life." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. 15 years of being observed without knowing it should have made him angry, violated. Instead, he felt oddly comforted. "Why didn't you approach me sooner?" "Because you were healing," she said simply. "I could see it in the way you moved, the careful way you built your routines. Someone had hurt you badly, and you needed time to remember who you were without them. I couldn't intrude on that process, so you just waited. I watched seasons change through your eyes, saw you grow stronger, more at peace. Your solitude became my solitude. Your healing became my hope that perhaps damaged things could still find purpose." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You saved me, Marcus, without even knowing I needed saving. You reminded me what it meant to choose gentleness over violence, peace over chaos." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Marcus realized that somewhere during her story, his fear had transformed into something else entirely. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Two damaged souls, finding unexpected solace in each other's existence. The storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke as Marcus stood in the doorway, watching Elena pace the length of his cabin like a caged predator. Lightning illuminated her pale features in stark relief, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was, something otherworldly and dangerous. "You can't keep avoiding this conversation," she said, without turning to face him. Her voice carried an edge he'd never heard before, sharp enough to cut glass. 3 days, Marcus. 3 days since you learned what I am, and you've barely said 10 words to me." He closed the door against the wind and rain, his fingers lingering on the rough wood. "What exactly do you want me to say? That I'm fine with learning the woman I've been falling in love with is a creature that feeds on human blood?" Elena whirled around, her dark eyes flashing with something between hurt and fury. creature? Is that truly how you see me now?" The pain in her voice made his chest tighten, but Marcus forced himself to hold her gaze. "I don't know what I see anymore. Everything I thought I knew about you, about us, it was all built on lies." "Not lies," she said fiercely. "Never lies. I may have withheld the truth about my nature, but everything else, every moment we've shared, every word I've spoken about how I feel, that was real." Thunder crashed overhead, and Marcus flinched. The storm seemed to mirror the chaos in his mind, the way his carefully ordered world had been turned upside down. He'd spent the last 3 days chopping wood with violent intensity, hiking the mountain trails until his legs ached, doing anything to avoid confronting the impossible truth. Elena was a vampire, had been for over 2 centuries, and she'd been watching him long before they'd ever spoken, drawn by something she couldn't explain any more than he could. "You've been stalking me for decades," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Watching me from the shadows like some kind of predator sizing up prey." "That's not," Elena started, then stopped, her shoulders sagging. "Perhaps it began that way. I won't insult you by claiming otherwise. But it changed, Marcus. You have to believe that it changed." "When?" The question exploded out of him, carrying all his frustration and confusion. "When exactly did it stop being about whatever sick fascination you had with the hermit on the mountain? When you decided to finally introduce yourself? When you let me kiss you? When you let me fall in love with you?" Elena's composure cracked, and for the first time since her revelation, she looked vulnerable. "When I realized I was in love with you too." The admission hung between them, like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Marcus felt his resolve wavering, the anger that had sustained him for 3 days beginning to crumble. He'd seen the truth in her eyes that night when she'd saved him from the other vampires, the ones who'd come hunting for her. She'd fought them with deadly grace, protecting him without hesitation, and afterward, when she thought he was unconscious, he'd heard her whispered apology for bringing danger to his door. "How do I trust that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "How do I trust anything when your very existence challenges everything I believed about the world?" Elena moved closer, her steps careful and measured. "The same way I learned to trust you, day by day, moment by moment, by choosing to believe that what we have is worth the risk." "The risk?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Elena, you're immortal. You've lived through centuries while I've barely managed 4 decades. You're asking me to trust someone who could snap my neck without breaking a sweat, who needs blood to survive, who loves you enough to walk away if that's what you truly want." Her words stopped him cold. Elena stood just a few feet away now, close enough that he could see the unshed tears in her eyes, could smell the familiar scent of rain and wildflowers that always seemed to cling to her. "Is that what you want?" she whispered. "For me to leave? To disappear back into the shadows and let you return to your solitude?" Marcus stared at her, this impossible woman who had shattered his careful isolation and shown him that his heart wasn't as dead as he'd believed. She was offering him exactly what he'd thought he wanted, his old life back, safe and predictable and empty. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm raging outside. Elena waited, motionless as a statue, and Marcus realized that despite her supernatural strength and immortal nature, she was completely vulnerable in this moment. Her fate rested in his all-too-human hands. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the crossroads where his life now stood. Behind him lay the safe harbor of solitude he'd inhabited for years. Ahead lay the terrifying unknown of a love that defied every natural law he understood. Marcus took a step forward, then another, until Elena was close enough to touch. The storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke just as Marcus reached for the ancient leather tome Lydia had placed on his kitchen table. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the cabin's windows, while rain lashed against the glass with supernatural fury. The timing felt deliberate, as if the very elements were responding to the weight of what lay before him. "The covenant of eternal binding," Lydia said softly, her pale fingers tracing the cracked spine. written in the old tongue, sealed with blood and starlight. It contains the ritual that could transform you. Marcus stared at the book, his heart hammering against his ribs. For weeks now they had danced around this possibility, this ultimate choice that would either unite them forever or destroy everything he had ever known about himself. The worn leather seemed to pulse under the flickering candlelight as if it contained a heartbeat of its own. "Tell me again what it means," he said, though he had memorized every word of their previous conversations about the transformation. Lydia moved closer, her supernatural grace making no sound against the wooden floor. "Death first. Your mortal body must release its hold on your soul. Then rebirth, painful, violent, but brief. When you wake, you'll be like me, stronger, faster, immortal, but also bound to the darkness, forever hungry for what you once were." Her honesty was both terrifying and comforting. In all the weeks since she had revealed her true nature, Lydia had never sugar-coated the reality of vampiric existence. She spoke of the endless nights, the isolation from humanity, the constant struggle against the beast that lived within every creature of her kind. "And if something goes wrong?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Then you die, truly and completely. There would be no coming back, no second chances." Lydia's voice carried centuries of grief. "I've seen the ritual attempted 12 times across the ages. Only 4 succeeded. The others—" She let the implication hang in the air like smoke. Marcus opened the tome, revealing pages covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight. The text was written in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow the meaning filtered into his consciousness, like water seeping through stone. Images flashed through his mind, moonlit ceremonies, ancient forests, lovers choosing eternity over the safety of separation. "Why now?" he asked suddenly. "You've watched me for decades. You could have approached me years ago, could have offered this choice when I was younger, stronger." Lydia's laugh was soft and melancholy. "Because I was a coward. Because I told myself that watching you from afar was enough, that I could love you without destroying you. But time—" She paused, her ageless face showing every year of her long existence. "Time has a way of making cowards of us all. I realized I would rather face your rejection, your death, even your hatred, than spend another decade pretending I could live without you." The admission hit him like a physical blow. Marcus had spent years believing himself to be the damaged one, the man too broken by betrayal to risk love again. But here was this ancient, powerful creature admitting to the same fears that had kept him isolated in these mountains. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in stark white relief. For just a moment, Marcus thought he saw shapes moving between the trees, tall, pale figures that vanished the instant the light faded. His blood ran cold. "Lydia." His voice was tight with sudden fear. "Are we alone?" She was at the window instantly, her body coiled with predatory tension. Her nostrils flared, and a low growl rumbled in her chest. "No. They found us." "They?" "The Conclave. My kind. They don't approve of what I'm offering you." Her fangs extended, catching the candlelight like polished ivory. "The transformation of humans is forbidden without their consent. They consider it an abomination." Marcus felt the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "How many?" 6, maybe 7. Ancient ones, older than me." Lydia turned from the window, her eyes now glowing with an inner fire. "Marcus, we need to choose. Now. Either we attempt the ritual tonight, during the storm when their senses are dulled, or we run. But if we run, they'll never stop hunting us." The tome seemed to grow heavier in his hands. Everything was happening too fast, spinning beyond his control like the storm outside. This was supposed to be his choice, made in his own time, carefully considered and planned. Instead, he was being forced to decide between mortality and the unknown, between safety and love, between the life he had built and the eternity Lydia offered. Thunder crashed again, closer this time. In the distance, Marcus heard something that made his soul freeze, howling but not from any wolf. These voices carried an inhuman hunger that spoke of ancient rage and supernatural fury. Time was running out. The cabin felt different in the morning light, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of Ilara's revelation. Marcus sat at the edge of his bed, watching her sleep in the chair by the window, her form ethereal in the pale dawn, filtering through frost-covered glass. Even in rest, she maintained an otherworldly grace that reminded him she was something far beyond his understanding. The bite mark on his throat throbbed with a dull ache that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He touched it gently, feeling the tender puncture wounds that had already begun to heal with supernatural speed. The memory of her fangs piercing his skin should have terrified him, yet all he could recall was the overwhelming sensation of connection, of being truly known for the first time in decades. Ilara stirred, her eyes opening to meet his immediately, as if she had been aware of his gaze even in sleep. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice carrying centuries of concern. "Different," Marcus admitted, rolling his shoulders as if testing the limits of his body. "Stronger, somehow. More alive than I've felt in years, which seems ironic given the circumstances." She rose from the chair with fluid motion, crossing to sit beside him on the bed. Her cool fingers traced the bite mark, and he shivered at her touch. "The blood exchange creates a bond," she explained softly. "You're not turning, not yet. But you'll carry a part of me now, just as I carry a part of you." The implications of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I can feel your emotions, sense when you're in danger. Distance becomes irrelevant between us." Her dark eyes searched his face. "It also means that if you choose mortality, if you walk away from this life, the bond will eventually fade. But while it exists, you'll age more slowly, heal faster, and possess strength beyond normal human limits." Marcus stood, pacing to the window where he could see his lands stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The mountains that had been his sanctuary for so long now felt like the bars of a prison. "And if I choose immortality, then the bond becomes eternal, unbreakable. You would become like me, a creature of shadow and hunger, powerful beyond measure but forever separated from the world of the living." Her voice carried the weight of lonely centuries. "I won't lie to you, Marcus. The transformation is agony, and what emerges is not entirely the same person who went into it." He turned back to her, studying the perfect features that had haunted his dreams long before he knew she was real. "Is that what you want? For me to choose that life?" Ilara's composure cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerability beneath her ancient confidence. "What I want is irrelevant. I've walked this earth for 800 years, Marcus. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched countless mortals live and die while I remained unchanged. The choice must be yours alone, free from my influence or desires." "But you do have desires," he pressed, stepping closer. "You've watched me for decades, protected me from threats I didn't even know existed. That doesn't happen without feeling." She looked away, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Yes, I have desires. I desire to feel the warmth of your skin against mine for eternity. I desire to share the burden of immortality with someone who understands isolation and pain. I desire to never again watch someone I care about grow old and die while I remain frozen in time." Her voice broke slightly on the last words. "But my desires have led to nothing but destruction in the past." Marcus reached for her hands, gently uncurling her fingers and intertwining them with his own. The contrast between his warmth and her coolness seemed symbolic of the choice before him. "Tell me about the destruction." "I turned someone once, 3 centuries ago, a young woman named Catherine, who reminded me of the sister I'd lost to plague when I was still human." Ilara's eyes grew distant with memory. "I thought I was saving her, giving her the gift of eternal life. Instead, I created a monster who couldn't control her hunger. She slaughtered entire families before I was forced to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You had to kill her," Marcus said quietly. I had to destroy what I had created. The guilt has haunted me ever since. I swore I would never inflict this curse on another soul, no matter how much I might love them. The word love hung in the air between them, unspoken acknowledgement of the emotions that had drawn them together across the impossible divide of species and centuries. Marcus lifted her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. "What if this time is different?" he asked. "What if I'm strong enough to handle the transformation, to remain myself despite the change? And what if you're not?" she countered, though her resolve seemed to be weakening. "What if I lose you to the monster the way I lost Catherine?" "Then we'll face that possibility together," Marcus said firmly. "But I won't let fear of what might happen rob us of what could be." The ancient tome lay open between them on the rough-hewn table, its yellowed pages crackling like autumn leaves in the flickering candlelight. Marcus traced the archaic symbols with trembling fingers, while Lydia sat motionless beside him, her marble skin luminous in the dancing shadows. "Here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind howling through the cabin's eaves. "This passage speaks of the ritual of eternal binding." Marcus leaned closer, inhaling her intoxicating scent of midnight jasmine and something darker, more primal. The Latin words swam before his eyes, but Lydia's translation carved itself into his consciousness with surgical precision. "The mortal must willingly surrender 3 things," she continued, her fingertip hovering over the text: his blood, his breath, and his beating heart. In return, the immortal surrenders her solitude, her hunger, and her eternal wandering. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney like dying stars. Marcus sat back, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a mountain of stone. 3 days had passed since their confrontation with the hunters, 3 days of stolen moments and whispered confessions, but the reality of what lay ahead still felt surreal. "What does it mean, exactly?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Lydia's eyes met his, those impossible violet depths reflecting centuries of loneliness. "It means I would make you like me, immortal, but the process—" She hesitated, her composure cracking for just an instant. "It's not like the stories, Marcus. It's not a simple bite and transformation. The ritual requires me to drain you completely, to the very edge of death, and then share my essence with you as your mortal life expires. And if something goes wrong, then you die, truly die. And I continue my existence knowing I destroyed the only person I've ever loved." The honesty in her voice cut through him like a blade. Outside, the storm that had been building all evening finally unleashed its fury against the cabin walls. Rain lashed the windows, while thunder rolled across the peaks like the footsteps of giants. Marcus stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. His reflection stared back at him, weathered and scarred from years of isolation. Behind it, Lydia's reflection was notably absent, a reminder of the vast chasm between their natures. "Tell me about the hunters again," he said suddenly. Lydia's reflection appeared in his peripheral vision as she approached. "They're an old family, the Blackwoods. They've been tracking supernatural beings for generations. Elena, their leader, she's persistent. Will they find us here?" "Eventually. This storm might buy us a few days, but they have resources, connections. They won't stop until they destroy me." She paused, her hand almost touching his shoulder before falling away. "Which is why you need to make your choice soon. If you decide against the ritual, I'll leave tonight. I won't let them hurt you because of me." Marcus turned to face her, noting how the candlelight seemed to bend around her form, creating an ethereal halo. "And if I choose the ritual, then we face them together, as equals." The simplicity of it struck him. All his life, he'd been running from one form of betrayal or another. His ex-wife's infidelity, his business partner's theft, the countless small cruelties that had driven him to these mountains in search of peace. But here stood a creature who had watched him for decades, who had fallen in love with his solitude and strength, who offered him a love that could literally last forever. "Show me," he said quietly. Lydia tilted her head. "Show you what? Your true nature, not the controlled version you've been showing me. I need to see what I'd be becoming." For a moment, Lydia's careful composure shattered entirely. Fear flickered across her features, raw and vulnerable. "Marcus, you don't understand what you're asking." "Yes, I do." He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in her violet eyes. "If I'm going to spend eternity with you, I need to see all of you." The change began slowly, like frost spreading across glass. Her canine teeth elongated into gleaming points, while her nails extended into razor-sharp talons. Her skin took on an otherworldly pallor, and her eyes blazed with an inner fire that spoke of blood and hunger and nights that stretched across centuries. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ages. "This is what I am, Marcus, a predator, a killer, beautiful and terrible and forever hungry." But instead of recoiling, Marcus felt something settle into place within his chest, like a key turning in a long-locked door. This was truth, raw and unfiltered. This was honesty in its most brutal form. He reached out and cupped her transformed face in his hands, feeling the supernatural heat radiating from her skin. "Then, make me the same," he whispered. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the cabin in stark white brilliance, and in that moment their fates became irrevocably intertwined. The transformation began at sunset, when the last rays of light filtered through the cabin windows like dying embers. Elias felt it first as a burning in his chest, spreading outward through his veins like liquid fire. He gripped the wooden table until his knuckles went white, fighting against the urge to scream. "It will pass," Serafina whispered, her cool hand pressed against his fevered forehead. "The initial pain always does." But this wasn't what he had expected. When he'd made his choice 3 nights ago, when he'd looked into her ancient eyes and said yes to forever, he thought he understood what he was accepting. The hunger, the darkness, the endless years stretching ahead, these were abstractions then, philosophical concepts he could wrap his mind around. This agony tearing through his body was visceral, immediate, and utterly consuming. His vision blurred, then sharpened beyond human capability. He could see dust motes dancing in the fading light, count the individual wood grains in the floorboards, watch the subtle rise and fall of Serafina's chest, a breathing pattern she maintained purely for his comfort, since she no longer needed air. "How long?" he managed to gasp. "Hours, perhaps until dawn." Her voice carried centuries of experience, but underneath it he detected something he'd never heard from her before: uncertainty. "You're fighting it more than most. Your will is formidable." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same stubborn determination that had kept him isolated on this mountain, that had built walls around his heart after Rebecca's betrayal, was now making his rebirth into something eternal a more agonizing process. Even in transformation, he couldn't simply let go. Another wave of fire coursed through him, and this time he did cry out. The sound that emerged from his throat was neither fully human nor completely other, a harbinger of what he was becoming. Through the haze of pain, he felt Serafina's fingers threading through his hair, anchoring him to something real. "Tell me about the first time you saw me," he whispered, desperate for distraction. Her laugh was soft, musical. "You were chopping wood behind the cabin your grandfather built. It was 1987, and you couldn't have been more than 8 years old. You had this fierce concentration, trying to split logs far too big for you to handle properly." The pain receded slightly as her voice washed over him. "I watched you from the tree line for hours, fascinated by your determination. Most children would have given up, but you kept swinging that axe until you managed to split every piece. You've been watching me since I was a child." The thought should have disturbed him, but instead it felt like a revelation. All those years of loneliness, of believing himself forgotten by the world, and she had been there. Not watching precisely, checking, returning every few months to see how you were growing, what kind of man you might become. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. I've lived for 8 centuries, Elias. I've seen empires rise and fall, witnessed humanity's greatest triumphs and darkest moments. But I had never encountered someone who carried solitude like armor the way you did. The burning in his chest intensified, and he felt something fundamental shifting inside him. His heartbeat, strong and steady for 38 years, began to slow. Each beat stretched longer than the last, like a clock winding down. "I'm dying," he said, surprised by how calm he sounded. "You're becoming," she corrected. "There's a difference." Through the window, full darkness had fallen. The world outside looked different now, not the familiar landscape of his mountain refuge, but a realm of shadows and hidden movements. He could sense life in ways he'd never imagined, the rabbits huddled in their warren 100 yards away, the owl beginning its nightly hunt, even the slow, patient breathing of the old bear that denned near the eastern ridge. His human heart gave one final, powerful beat, then stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was profound, like the moment between lightning and thunder. In that stillness, Elias felt every barrier he'd built around himself crumble, the walls that had protected him from Rebecca's betrayal, from his family's disappointment, from the world's expectations, all of it dissolved like mist before the dawn. When his eyes opened again, Serafina was leaning over him, her face luminous in the darkness. But it wasn't just her face he could see now. It was everything. The intricate pattern of her skin, the way starlight caught in her hair, the subtle luminescence that marked her as something beyond mortal. "How do you feel?" she asked. Elias sat up slowly, testing this new body that was his but different, stronger, more alive, paradoxically, than he'd ever felt as a living man. The constant ache in his lower back from years of manual labor was gone. The scar on his hand from a childhood accident had vanished. Even his vision, which had begun to blur slightly in recent years, was now perfect. But more than the physical changes, something had shifted in his very essence. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for decades was simply absent, complete, he said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel complete." The dawn light filtered through the cabin windows like spilled honey, catching the dust motes that danced in the air between them. Marcus traced the pale curve of Ilara's shoulder with his fingertip, marveling at how she seemed almost translucent in the morning glow, yet more real than anything he'd ever touched. "You're thinking too loudly," she murmured against his chest, her voice still thick with the remnants of their shared dream, a memory of hers from centuries past where they'd walked through moonlit gardens that no longer existed. "Just trying to wrap my head around forever," he admitted, his calloused hand finding hers. The contrast between his weathered skin and her porcelain perfection should have been jarring, but instead it felt like two puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. Ilara lifted her head, crimson eyes studying his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Are you having second thoughts?" The vulnerability in her ancient gaze nearly undid him. This creature who had walked the earth for over 500 years, who could move like shadow and strike like lightning, was afraid of his answer. Marcus cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing across her sharp cheekbones. "No," he said firmly, "but I need to understand what I'm becoming, what we're becoming." She sat up, pulling the thin sheet around herself like armor. The morning light revealed things the candlelight had hidden, the way her skin seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it, the complete absence of any human tells like pulse points, or the subtle rise and fall of unnecessary breathing. "The transformation isn't just physical," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had explained this before, long ago. "Your senses will heighten until you can hear a mouse's heartbeat from a mile away. You'll be stronger, faster, nearly indestructible. But the hunger—" She paused, something like pain flickering across her features. "The hunger changes everything." Marcus reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Show me, Marcus. Show me what you really are." The air in the cabin shifted, growing heavy with an otherworldly presence. Ilara's form seemed to blur at the edges, and when she moved, it was with fluid grace that defied natural law. Her canine teeth lengthened to deadly points, and her eyes blazed like fresh blood in firelight. The gentle creature who had whispered his name in passion transformed into something primordial and terrifying. Yet Marcus felt no fear. Instead, he was struck by her terrible beauty, the raw honesty of her true nature. This was who had been watching over him, protecting him, loving him from the shadows. "This is what you'll become," she said, her voice now carrying harmonic undertones that resonated in his bones. "A predator, a creature of night and blood and endless hunger. Will I still be me?" The question seemed to surprise her. She blinked, and when her features shifted back to their human mask, confusion clouded her expression. Yes, you'll still be you, enhanced, changed, but essentially you." She tilted her head, studying him. "Is that what you're worried about?" Marcus stood, moving to the window that overlooked his garden. The vegetables he'd tended so carefully seemed suddenly insignificant against the backdrop of eternity. "I've spent 10 years becoming someone I could live with, someone who could exist without destroying everything he touched. If I change now—" Understanding dawned in her eyes. She moved behind him, her cool touch settling on his shoulders. "The man who betrayed you, who made you flee to these mountains, he was weak, selfish. You are neither of those things." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've watched you for decades, Marcus. I've seen you choose isolation over risking harm to others. I've seen you save injured animals, share your food with starving travelers, leave supplies for hikers who ventured too far up the mountain. Your capacity for destruction exists. It exists in all of us, but so does your capacity for protection." He leaned back against her, drawing strength from her presence. "And if the hunger takes me, if I become a monster, then I'll stop you." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. "I've lived long enough to recognize the ones who can't resist the darkness. You're not one of them." Outside, the sun climbed higher, and Marcus realized this might be one of his last mornings to see it without the barrier of protective shadows. The thought should have frightened him, but instead he felt a strange sense of completion, as if his entire life had been leading to this moment. "When?" he asked. "Tonight, if you're ready. The new moon provides the best conditions for the change." Marcus turned in her arms, studying the face that had haunted his dreams long before he'd understood what she was. No more watching from the shadows. No more shadows, she promised, and when she kissed him, he tasted eternity on her lips. The dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Thomas stood at the threshold of his old life, watching Elena move through the space that had been his sanctuary for so long. She touched nothing, but her presence transformed everything. The rough-hewn walls seemed warmer, the sparse furniture less austere. "You're afraid," she said without turning around, her fingers trailing over the spine of a leather-bound journal on his desk. "Terrified," he admitted. The honesty felt like stepping off a cliff, but he'd made his choice in the darkness of the previous night. When she'd offered him immortality, offered him forever, he'd said yes with a certainty that surprised them both. Elena turned then, and he saw his own fear reflected in her ancient eyes. For all her centuries, for all the lovers she'd taken and lost, this was uncharted territory. The ritual that would transform him was as dangerous for her as it was for him, binding their souls in ways that couldn't be undone. "We could wait," she offered, though her voice carried no conviction. "I've waited 70 years. I could wait longer." Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her face in his hands. Her skin was cool marble under his palms, but he could feel the tremor that ran through her. No more waiting, no more watching from the shadows. "I'm tired of being afraid." She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. "The last time I tried this, he died screaming. The transformation tore him apart. I'm not him." Thomas pressed his forehead to hers. "And you're not the same vampire who made that choice out of loneliness. This is different. How can you be so certain?" because I know what it's like to live without you now, and I know I don't want to do it again." Elena's breath hitched, an unconscious reflex from her human days that surfaced in moments of deep emotion. When she opened her eyes, they held the weight of decision. It has to be now, before the sun gets too high. The transformation requires the border time when day and night exist together. They moved with quiet purpose, Elena retrieving a silver chalice from a leather satchel Thomas had never seen before. Her hands shook slightly as she set it on the table, and he realized she was more frightened than he was. For him, this was a leap into the unknown. For her, it was the risk of losing the one thing that had given her existence meaning after centuries of emptiness. "Tell me about the pain," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "It will feel like dying, because that's exactly what's happening. Your heart will stop. Your lungs will cease drawing breath. Every human system will shut down and rebuild itself." She lifted the chalice, examining the intricate engravings along its surface. "Some minds can't handle the transition, they fracture. And if mine does?" Elena's composure cracked. "Then I'll be alone again, but this time I'll know exactly what I've lost." Thomas reached across the table, covering her hands with his. "That won't happen. You can't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I trust you. I trust this." He gestured between them, encompassing everything they'd built in their stolen moments together. "Whatever I become, it will still be me. Changed, but me." Elena nodded, though tears traced silver paths down her cheeks. She bit into her wrist with practiced efficiency, and Thomas watched his future drip into the chalice. The blood was darker than he'd expected, nearly black in the morning light. "Last chance," she whispered. Instead of answering, he took the chalice from her hands. The metal was warm where her fingers had touched it, cold everywhere else. He met her gaze and drank deeply. The taste was copper and starlight, earth and eternity. It burned going down, but not unpleasantly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his vision began to blur around the edges, and Elena was there, pulling him into her arms as his legs gave out. "I've got you," she murmured against his hair. "I won't let go." The pain started slowly, a dull ache in his chest that built to a crushing weight. His heart stuttered, fighting against the change, before stopping altogether. The silence in his chest was deafening. Elena's voice became distant, though he could feel her lips moving against his temple, could sense rather than hear the ancient words she spoke. Darkness claimed him in waves, each one pulling him deeper. But through it all, he held on to the anchor of Elena's presence, the certainty that whatever he became on the other side of this death would be worthy of her weight. When awareness finally returned, the world had transformed. Every sound was crystal clear, every scent distinct and meaningful, and Elena's face, hovering over his with desperate hope, was more beautiful than any mere human eyes could have perceived. He was no longer human. He was hers.